Hello, hello. This is Daniel Ashcraft, and I am going to be teaching on the Synoptic Gospels, what they are, why we call them Synoptic Gospels, and just different things like that. So let's just get into it. I don't have a whole lot of time. If I can, there we go. All right, the Synoptic Gospels consist of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Um, John is kind of its own thing. It's written a bit later, and it doesn't exactly line up with Matthew, Mark, and Luke when it comes to their structure and their content. Um, Mark, Matthew, and Luke are kind of put into this clump together, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic just meaning seen together, or seen alike, or seen similar, or seen similarly. Um, each of the Gospels, even though they are somewhat similar, all have unique portrayals of Jesus. Mark, who is John Mark, a disciple of Peter, who we find in Acts, um, is the disciple of Peter, like I said, and Peter's perspective on Jesus is a very unique one, as kind of like the right-hand man. Peter, or Jesus, said, I will build my church on you, or you as the stone. Peter has a very unique perspective on Jesus as the suffering servant of God who offers himself as a sacrifice for sins. This probably comes from the conversation between Jesus and Peter, where Jesus says he has to be the sacrificial lamb to cover the sins of everyone. And Peter takes him aside and says, no, you won't. That's not going to happen. And Jesus' response is, get behind me, Satan. Um, so you can kind of see where Peter's perspective and focus on Jesus is that sacrifice, and that suffering that Jesus goes through. Um, Next we have Matthew. Matthew sees Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of Old Testament hopes. Um, I find this perspective interesting just because we see the only thing we really know of Matthew is he's a tax collector, and the fact that he is well versed in Old Testament scripture and Old Testament kind of pointing towards Jesus, that can only come from Jesus' teaching on the Old Testament, like Isaiah. Isaiah seems to be one of Jesus's like favorite prophets when it comes to fulfilling that kind of Old Testament hopes. So I find that perspective interesting. And then we have Luke. Luke is a physician, and he's closely related, or not related, but connected to Paul. Paul being the apostle to the Gentiles, it is very easy to see how Luke being connected to Paul, who is trying to um, preach the gospel to all the nations and all the Gentiles, he's the most inclusive of all of the different gospels. And kind of what I want to talk about today is, I guess, the main point is the structure and format of why Matthew, Mark, and Luke look so similarly. It is believed by biblical scholars that Mark came first. Mark, being probably one of the shortest, it is one of the shortest gospels and one of the shorter stories about Jesus. And typically, scholars say it came first. Next, we either have Matthew or Luke. Typically, we would see Matthew coming in a little bit after Mark. Just kind of clarifying and kind of expanding on what Mark says. Mark is very straight to the point and leaves out a bit of detail that we find in Matthew and Luke. Next, we have Luke, which has 88% of Mark that is found in Luke, and we see this um, kind of interesting. We see this overlap between Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And next, we have this thing called Q. Q is this, I guess, final piece of the puzzle. And not really, but it is either, some scholars say or point to this Q as either a document or just the eyewitness testimony of people around Jerusalem. And to kind of explain where this idea of Q came from, a little diagram. It's kind of just cheaply made, but it gets to the point. First we start off with Mark. Mark being the first of the Gospels written, just from archaeological evidence, and then based on how the other two are written. Then comes Luke or Matthew. It doesn't really matter the order here. And then Matthew. And so if I can get a laser pointer, there we are. See this overlap of Mark, Luke, and Matthew. This isn't perfect. Obviously 98% of Mark is found in Matthew. This is not 98, 97%. It's fine. But the overlap, all of this, you can easily find out. But then you have this little overlap, and this little area is called Q. And so that is what kind of people say and people point to in the Gospels, saying, oh, there has to be, or there should be, this other document that points to, oh, the similarities between Luke and Matthew are just so prevalent. There should be, or there might be, this other resource called Q. But that is kind of all I have time for today. Thank you.